Let's get sweaty.
Hey guys, welcome to another Shenmue Dojo video. Today's video I'm going to be looking at Shenmue and the Virtua Fighter RPG and asking the question of whether Shenmue would have been better off staying under the Virtua Fighter umbrella, essentially remaining Virtua Fighter RPG. I'm going to have a quick look at the history, talk about the gameplay potential a little bit, characters presentation, the brand recognition and some spin-offs, and give some overall thoughts at the end as well. I'll be flicking through a couple of articles that I've found based on this topic to give some historical context as well, which I think is really, really helpful and will hopefully aid us in maybe one day, getting the Saturn build of Shenmue. And it probably would have been known as Akira's Journey back then. So, little bit of history around this already. Virtua Fighter, as everybody knows, is very much the grandfather of 3D fighters. Come out in the arcades in 1993 with a Saturn port later on in 1994. Wildly successful. It set the benchmark for fighting games, for 3D fighting games. Fantastic. It was groundbreaking, and even to this day it is still recognised as probably one of the most finely balanced and tuned fighting games out there. Allegedly Virtua Fighter is going to have a new entry in the series, hopefully soon. Don't mess with the formula too much, please, Sega. Just please don't. Leave it as it is. But anyway, going into some history now. Yu Suzuki went on to a China trip in 1994, which a lot of the research from that sort of ended up being used for Shenmue, for want of a better expression. So some of the slides that you see in the GDC conference of 2014 from that China trip, you can see Baji Quan being demonstrated. You can see sort of examples of the Great Wall in China. You can see all sorts of bits and pieces which end up in the Shenmue series, which was originally done for Virtua Fighter 2, this research, which then lent into the original development cycle for Virtua Fighter RPG, then coming on obviously on into Shenmue. 1995 kicks in, and you then have the Old Man and the Peach Tree concept demo. This, I am told, and so what I've read in the research, and I'll pull up an article that shows about this a bit later, was running on base Sega Saturn stock hardware, which was essentially a concept demo, and is in the vaults of Sega somewhere. Perhaps it's probably never going to see the light of day, but it was essentially a concept of people walking around and talking. And your task was to find a Grandmaster named Ryo, with the setting being Luang in China, which we know has been talked about for Shenmue going on and further forward. Things obviously then accelerated into full production with Virtua Fighter RPG Akira's Story. It's around 1996. There was then a platform shift around 1997, which was allegedly, or seemed to be on, from what the comments are and what's out there on the internet, on an accelerated Sega Saturn build. And then the final move over to Project Berkeley, Shenmue, Dreamcast, later on towards 1997, 1998. But rather than me sort of sitting here talking all about the history, I am going to just bring up an article from Sega Saturn Shiro and also Phantom River Stone, which summarises this probably far better than I can. So let's have a dig into this right now. So here we are on SegaSaturnShiro.com. Check them out. If you want Sega Saturn expertise, these guys are, the creme de la creme, is all I need to say. They are fantastic. They know their stuff and are brilliantly well informed. So they talk a little bit here about Shenmue on the Saturn, and this is taken from Phantom Riverstone. The article is just here, just so you can see that it's taken from there. And essentially, it performed really well on the Saturn. The quality was impressive and stretched over to Guilin. There'd been a lot of work put into the Saturn version before they decided to remake it for the Dreamcast. Now, this is interesting. The next point here, which you can see on my mouse here, in order it to run on a Saturn, it had been specifically expanded with an acceleration board, and they'd already remade it once. So they had some sort of concept, thought to be the Old Man and the Peach Tree, run on Sega Saturn, then a bigger build on accelerated Saturn before then remaking it again on Dreamcast, or which would under the project name of Project Berkeley. You can see where the money went in terms of the budget if they've remade this game 3 times already. But there we are. We'll sort of leave that as it is. Moving down this article from Sega Saturn Shiro, this little bit here sort of summarises it really nicely here. So you had what is thought to be a first build on stock Saturn hardware, Old Man and the Peach Tree. The second build on the extended or accelerated Sega Saturn hardware, which is Project Guppy, which we know. And then the third build on Katana, which was obviously the code name for the Dreamcast at the time, under the project name of Project Berkeley. And then obviously Shenmue released in 1999 with the title changed over to Shenmue in 1998. The history of this thing is insane. And one of the upcoming videos I'm going to have will talk a little bit about that. And I've got some special expertise on the show with me who know far more about this than I do. And I don't want to not do that justice. So that's the history of it. It's long, it's protracted. One day I hope we see the Saturn build. But coming on now to gameplay. The gameplay originally stating this is around 1996-ish, maybe into 1997, you would have had 45 hours total gameplay. The slide from GDC details the breakdown of this, and it would have essentially been a one and done type game or series. So there's a few questions here. The first question is, would it finish things? Yes, it would. Most likely. It would have been much faster paced. And the second question is, how or when did this expand out into what essentially we got in Shenmue, which was this massive open world, all these characters, and all the things that went with it that we love so much? But anyway, so the gameplay would have been 45 hours, which back in that time would have been quite a lengthy game as well, given games were more arcadey. There were obviously RPGs out there and longer games, but most games were sort of 3-4 hours, bam, done, thank you, see you later, move on to the next one, or lots of replayability, etc., and very much based off the arcades of the time. So this would have been more different, breaking the mold essentially. Obviously you had the Final Fantasy series, you had other RPGs out there, but the popularity of those, in my opinion, I mean, it could be wrong, wasn't quite there, as certainly isn't there as they are now today. So a 45-hour game would have been quite a lengthy game. I would have expected much less focus on world-building. It would probably been a more linear experience, perhaps. Obviously, we know Shenmue went into 11 chapters. There was talk that it was 16 at one point. I also anticipate, in terms of the gameplay, we may have seen a little bit more about Akira or Ryo's backstory, given that the scripts of Phantom Riverstone, translated a few years back, make reference to the Yuki Dojo and some interaction between Akira and Iwao at the time. Would we have had more fighting? Potentially, because it would obviously been around the Virtual Fighter system and characters, so they may have honed in on a little bit, but a bit more. Would we have had as many mini-games? I don't know. Gameplay-wise, it's hard to say. Other than that, had it stuck to the original concept idea at the time of the 45 hours, the whole thing would have been finished and would have been done. Would all the side characters have been fleshed out as we got in Shenmue 1 and 2 and 3? Doubtful. But things would have obviously moved much faster, would have had things finished, and we would have moved on. I think it'd been more linear. I think you'd have had some elements of the free stuff we had in Shenmue, but obviously the concept from this expanded greatly away from sort of a more linear experience. So I think the gameplay, there would have been, certainly the roots of it would have been very Shenmue, and certainly the Shenmue we got, but I anticipate it would be much faster paced, would have moved from story point to story point much faster, much quicker, less detail around some of the characters perhaps. You may have had more fighting, less free time, less mini games perhaps. I don't know. This is just me just sort of spitballing an idea here. But it seemed to me it would have been a more focused and honed experience. Great in some aspects, not great in others, in the fact that obviously the world of Shenmue 1 and 2 were mind-blowing at the time. So would have had that sort of impact that maybe would it have done? I don't know. The impact of what it ended up being to what I think may have originally been planned would have been very, very different. Moving away from gameplay, and that's I could talk about that all day. You come on to the characters. Shenmue's characters we know are inspired from the Virtua Fighter RPG and all the Virtua Fighter artwork that's out there. It's pretty common, it's pretty obvious, and it's common knowledge out there essentially. But I think the difference would have been here in a Virtua Fighter RPG, would have interacted, you would presume, with more the actual Virtua Fighter characters themselves. So, for example, you could have met Kage, for example, just in part of the journey. You could have met Jackie, Sarah, whoever, rather than when you think of for example, Sarah, you obviously fight Chunyun in Kowloon, in Shenmue 2. That could have been Sarah, for example, given that they share the same martial art style. It's clearly a spin-off of Sarah from Virtua Fighter. So that sort of thing, you'd have probably come across those characters in those situations, perhaps over what we got in Shenmue, which is obviously inspired characters from Virtua Fighter, but obviously then modified, changed for Shenmue. So that's a sort of a brief touch on the characters. Whether Ryo or Akira would have had a different personality or feel, I don't know. Wow, from what's in the scripts that Switch translated, doesn't seem to have had much in there. So it's really hard to say how much the characters from Shenmue and Virtua Fighter would have stayed the same, how much they crossed over, and how they might have branched away in terms of their different personality traits. We don't really know, but it's an exciting concept to think about, and one that I think would be a wider discussion point going forward. Coming on to presentation, the article I showed obviously comes onto this a little bit. I think the Saturn version of Shenmue or Virtua Fighter RPG looked fantastic. I think you'd have had the same levels of presentation had it obviously then go over to Dreamcast, but under the Shenmue banner or the Virtua Fighter banner. I think the level of presentation would have still been mind-blowing at the time. I think you'd have still got a really good, groundbreaking look at the time, which would have been fantastic for everybody. Like I said, would it have had the substance potentially? Going back to the gameplay and the story, who knows? But then the next, probably more important point here, is the brand recognition and the spin-offs and the potential of marketability here. Going back all the way back to 1993, Virtua Fighter set the line in the sand. It was the benchmark, and then Virtua Fighter 2 came out in 1994, and it went bam, even higher. Virtua Fighter 3, even higher. So you had this brand here that was recognised as the top of the top. It was groundbreaking. It set the line in the sand. It changed fighting games forever. They even now, Tekken, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, the 3D iterations of these games, obviously Tekken was 3D off the bat, but you get my point. They still draw inspiration from Virtua Fighter now. So the brand recognition is still massive. And at the time, at the height of its popularity in the 90s into the early 2000s, you'd have had a brand that was on fire at the time. So would that have translated to better sales, perhaps? Potentially, given that it was already a recognised, well-established and respected brand under the AM2 banner at Sega. Obviously, Yu Suzuki headed that, so it's well-established. So going along that line, you'd have had Virtua Fighter RPG is an extended brand within that overall overarching brand of Virtua Fighter. When you think of sales, I mean, Virtua Fighter has a total sales breakdown now, as sort of the figures are at the moment, 18.8 million across all entries. I think, don't quote me if I'm wrong here, I think Virtua Fighter 1 sold around 2.2 million on Saturn, which at the time wasn't bad, but whether it would have had more popularity on a different console, who knows? And there's decisions back there in terms of Sega and everything else that happened that may have affected that. But it was well known, well respected within the industry, and well respected by gamers of the time, and still is today. So it could have marketed itself here. You've got a brand that's established, brilliant, quality. You use the poster boy of Akira, and you sell his story under that umbrella, a story from a boy becoming a man and his journey to avenge his father. You show off the gameplay elements, you show off the Virtua Fighter engine in terms of the fighting, and I think you would have been onto an absolute winner. You wouldn't have had to have spent so much money marketing this whole new IP, potentially. You could have done it under Virtua Fighter. And then there's also the idea of spin-offs here and other expansions. So, for example, two ideas I had, sort of origin titles that could have been made as a sort of follow-on from this, would have been that we could have had Kage and his mother being turned into Jarell by Judgment 6, for example. Jackie and Sarah being brainwashed by J6 are just two examples that could have been told through further sort of RPG-type titles, which would have been brilliantly done. Shame it didn't happen, but just sort of more money-making potential for this. So my overall sort of thoughts are, it's really, really hard that, given that obviously what Shenmue ended up becoming, as it was, as it is, and as it will be, certainly at the moment, it's really difficult to say that under the Virtua Fighter umbrella, that sort of game would have had any better success than Shenmue did. You know, I mean, Shenmue 1 sold pretty well on Dreamcast, 1.2 million sales, give or take a bit. Would it have sold more? Who knows? The Shenmue game that we got under a Virtua Fighter umbrella, while it was brilliant, I don't think it would have changed things too much in the way it is sold. Had it been a more focused story experience on the sort of 45-hour mark, the spin-offs, you get remakes, remasters, etc., 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 you then potentially end up with a far more successful franchise based already off of one that, like I said, set the benchmark for 3D fighters going forward, and still to this day is revered as one of those titles from Yu Suzuki, AM2, Sega, etc. So it's really tough to say that under a Virtua Fighter name, the Shenmue that we got would have been more successful. And I really don't think there's a straight answer to it. There's much more to it around gameplay, marketing, so much more than just changing a name, for example. But guys, what do you think? Would it have sold more? Would it have been more successful? Would the gameplay have been different? Would it have seen different characters? Would it have been a different experience altogether? Drop us a comment, guys, and let us know what you think below. The last thing that I need to do, guys, is just give a shout out to our members. For £2 a month, you can sign up and get all the video content ahead of time. If you don't sign up to it, it's not a problem. You still get the video content on release. We do this, all of this apart from the podcast, which we like to keep as premieres. Nothing is locked behind a paywall. But for the 28 of you that have signed up, thank you very much. All the money goes to running the website and also competition prizes, etc. So I'm going to read you out in order. So Sam, Dominic Johnson, Sam Say, K&K, Renners, Richard Cartledge, that's me, Carl, Terry, Stuart Peacock, Mark Pulverizer, Little Crypty Monster, Titch, Richard King, Sean Potter, Guppy Coy, Bruce Wayne 937, Survival Spears, Peter Hoffland, Sean Don, Wandering Through Shenmue, Phantom Riverstone, Bruce Wayne 911, Mike Franz, Manny Figueroa, Master Mo, Nick Hughes, Sean Hastings, Clunky Mage, and William Lovering. Thank you for being members and enjoying the dojo content. Thank you, everybody who stuck with me for this long video. It's dived it again quite into a long analysis, but I like doing these sorts of things, and hopefully you're enjoying the content. James and I very much appreciate you dropping in and enjoying all the content that Dojo is putting out. Don't forget to give us a like, share, subscribe on the usual channels, and I'll be back with a video in the not too distant future. But for now, guys, take care and have a good one.